I want to show you something that's been going on in the country for a while. From 1913 on, and we're going to start with 1913 for a very interesting reason. 1913, okay, if you had a house in 1913, let's say you had a house here. This is the year. All right, I'm going to even try another marker here, see if we can get a darker marker. The average house in the United States sold for about $1,000. Okay, so about $1,000. Yeah, that's a little better, isn't it? Okay, and if you had a loaf of bread, if you bought a loaf of bread back in 1913, it cost a penny. And if you're into Mother Goose and all the rhymes, remember 1 penny, 2 penny, hot cross buns, all that stuff. Okay, you have to excuse me. I'm a grandfather, so I get into this. All right, but it's fun to see how things change here, because we're going to show you that there's a pattern. If we go to school, we get in history what's called existentialism, and I don't know if you know what existentialism means, but it means that there isn't any reason for anything; it just exists. If you really believe that, you can become a teacher. All right, we're going to show you that things don't just exist; that they are caused. And as the saying goes, yes, Virginia, there is a plan. Okay. And you're going to be amazed at this plan, I think, when you see it, because it's affecting all of us, and yet we don't realize what it is. It's sort of like we're in a riptide. We swim in, and then every Friday we swim back out. You know, when the paycheck comes in, we lose it all again. And we just live paycheck to paycheck. And the other 6 days of the week, we're trying to swim in, and payday, we swim back out. Okay. All right. Now, what we have here is a dollar then, back in 1913, was worth $1. And income tax in 1913, does anybody happen to know right offhand what the income tax was in 1913? Zero, right. Isn't that interesting? There was no income tax, was there? All right. Now, we're starting with 1913 because we're going to again and again and again come back to this, because we're going to demonstrate, I think before the meeting is over here, that the United States was a different country after 1913. It had different management, it had different goals, it had a different operation. We are actually witnessing the advent of two Americas, if you will. All right? And there are two Americas existing right now, side by side. Now, you may sound like, well, which way is out? Okay. I'm sure you haven't heard anything like this. Okay. But this is actually happening. Give me just a moment to demonstrate this. But there's two things going on here that we don't understand. And when we understand it, then it makes sense, and you can cope, and you can make all the money you want to make, and you don't have to lose any in taxes and stuff like that if you don't want to. Now, if you want to pay tax, that's fine. All right. In 1913, we had an organization start in our country called a central bank. We're going to be going into a central bank and what a central bank is, because this is not taught in history. We're taught in history, existentialism, the banks just come and go, there's no reason. Well, all right. Nothing that we're going to be learning today did I learn in school. Okay. This is interesting stuff. It's all in the School of Hard Knocks afterwards that we learned this. All right, the boys in the bank, the central bank, started printing money at a rate of 7.12%. Okay, 7.12% is what normally is known as the rule of 7, because if you print money at a rate of 7.12% and it's compound interest earning, every 10 years the money supply doubles. All right. Now, the problem with that is that the base of the wealth doesn't double. So we're talking about the money supply doubles in relationship to the amounts of goods and services available, if you will. All right, in other words, there's twice as much money to buy the same commodities. All right, this is referred to as M1, M2, M1, M2, so forth and so on. We want the M numbers up here, okay, because we're going to talk about this, because these guys all baffle you with all these M numbers, all right? Now, money is printed here, okay, so that means that here's the year over here. Okay, and every 10 years, this money doubles. Okay. Now, you may say, well, so what? Well, we have just described inflation. Okay, because by 1923, the money supply in the United States had doubled. There was twice as much money in 1923 as there was in 1913, but there wasn't any more base to it. In other words, it was like just adding water to the soup. Pretty soon the soup doesn't taste quite the same, does it? All right? So now, what do you suppose, having never maybe been to Stanford or anything like this, okay, what do you suppose happened to prices? Okay, but you're familiar with Stanford. It's the school up the coast. They used to call the football team the Big Red Machine. Of course, now that's what we call the faculty. Okay, now, so what happens here, you see, is that if you had gone to a business school up there, okay, they would teach you what inflation is. By the time you get out, it takes you about 2 hours to describe inflation. Okay, and when you get through, you realize the guy doesn't really know what it is. Okay, all right, what causes inflation is an increase in the supply of money. And you can extend that to credit, if you will. Okay, to a certain extent, credit can be money. But and I'm getting this right out of Webster's Ninth Collegiate Dictionary. This is not like some esoteric tome that I'm reading. This is the English definition of inflation. It's an increase in the supply of money. Okay? All right, so if there's twice as much money in existence, what do you suppose would happen to the price of the house? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Doubles. Well, you guys aren't very sophisticated. That's right, it doubles, you see. It doubles, okay? It would take 4 years of higher education to confuse that. Okay? All right? Okay? It's not easy to confuse this. It takes quite some time. Okay? And you get degrees in it. All right? Now, what do you suppose would happen to the loaf of bread? 2 cents. Okay, you were moving along here. This is great. Sharp crowd, okay? I take back everything I heard about L.A. Okay, now. All right, now. All right, dollars. Okay, what was the dollar worth? Right. See? Isn't this fun? See? Oh, boy. Now, there was an income tax because the law said in the 16th Amendment, we're going to get into the 16th Amendment because the 16th Amendment never passed. The 16th Amendment was only ratified by 4 states. It wasn't ratified by 2/3 of the states, which required for an amendment, okay? There are some books on the subject which we'll get to later on. We're going to talk about books later on because you're going to hear some pretty bizarre stuff from me, and I would just want to be able to document it, okay? We were going to now steal from the rich and give to the poor. Is this a good deal or what? That means for you to collect something, you didn't have to do anything. Is this great? You see how that works? See? And somebody who does produce something now is now stolen from. I mean, hey, this is a great system, isn't it? And they called it, I think there was a fellow by the name of Karl Marx. He was a show business guy that they put on the name of a book years ago. And 20 years after the book was written, his name was added to it to distract from who really wrote the book. We'll get into that in history. He said that this garbage, or whatever you want to call it, is that this is called from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Isn't that interesting? So if you have an ability to pay, you pay. And if you have a need, you receive. Is this great? This has built the tremendous system that we see in Russia today. After 80 years, they cannot produce a paperclip. Okay? Why? Because, let's just take for an example, okay, you get a plot of land over there, and you go out and you say, well, this is exciting, and they give you a tractor and all this because it's a state farm, isn't it? Yeah, no pun on the insurance company. Okay, what happens here is that, so you go out every morning at 5 o'clock and you farm this land, okay? And boy, you have a great harvest. Well, meanwhile, this dodo that lives next to you sleeps till noon every day. Well, you know, he's not too excited about it. Now, what happens at harvest time? You take your wheat into the government town, and the government gives you back equal amounts. I mean, because you're equal now, right? Isn't that interesting? So you make an interesting observation that on the day of harvest, he gets as much as you get. Get it? This is equality. Why, isn't this nice? Okay, the only question I have is, what time do you get up next year? Yeah. See, who produces the wheat? Nobody. Isn't that interesting? We have now described socialism. That takes about 3 years in the government school. Okay, now, so what are we learning here? Okay, we're learning that the information we have is pretty much bunko, isn't it? We don't know why we're broke. We don't know what's wrong with the country. We don't know why we can't keep what we earn. We don't know all these things, you see. And after the seminar today, we will. You may be mad, but you'll know it. Okay. Okay, now, and this is called, by the way, this is called M1, because that was the original supply of money. Okay. That's our first problem, is that the board doesn't erase. Okay. So we'll just use different colors as we go over it again and again, okay? All right, now, all right, this is known as M2. Why is this known as M2? Because there's twice as much money. It's money too, I guess. You know, I took years of this economic stuff, and if you ever wrote anything intelligent on a test, of course, you'd flunk the test, so you didn't put anything down that made any sense. Okay, that's economics, okay? Now, all right, we're in for another big surprise. What do you suppose happened in 1933? Moving right along, we now find that the boys keep printing the money here, and there may be some girls involved, I'm not sure. All right, and we have $4,000 for a house. We have 4 cents for a loaf of bread. We have 25 cents for worth of $1. We have a 1% income tax. Now, isn't that interesting? If you worked and worked and worked and you finally doubled your income, so you could stay even where you were the last 10 years, your taxes doubled. This is called surprise. Get it? It's called you have arrived, chop. Okay, now, okay, this is called M3 because the money supply doubled again. It's not called M4, it's called M3. It takes many years to get this remembered. Okay? Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, let's take a look at 1943. In 1943, we have an $8,000 house. We've got an 8-cent loaf of bread. We've got a 12-cent dollar. We've got a 2% income tax. We've got M4. All right, we'll try another one. Okay, 1953 rolls along. You won't guess what happens in 1953, or maybe you will. $16,000 house, 16-cent loaf of bread, 6-cent dollar, 4% income tax, M5. Moving right along, we now come to 1963. It takes a little while to understand history. All right, $32,000 for a house, 32 cents for a loaf of bread, 3 cents for a dollar, 8% income tax, M6. I'm going to show you what happens at M10. Okay? At M10, something magical happens, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Okay, 1973, we have a $64,000 house, a 64-cent loaf of bread, a dollar worth 2 cents, and a 16% income tax. We have M7. Moving right along, we come to 1983. We have a $128,000 house. We've got a $1.28 loaf of bread. We've got a dollar worth 1 cent. It takes 100 times more today to buy something than your grandfather paid in 1913. Plus, you're going to lose 32% in the taxes, which he didn't. You understand now why your grandpa had the farm and you don't, right? I mean, this is understandable? Okay, he was much better off. Okay, M8. Okay, moving right along, we come to 1993. And since this is going to be on a videotape, we won't tell you what year this is. We'll just keep going. Because, see, it really doesn't matter. This thing will be just as correct 20 years from now as it was today. Okay? We've got, oh golly, 128, what have we got there? $256,000 for a house, a $2.56 loaf of bread, a dollar worth 1/2 of 1 cent, and a 64% income tax, and we have M9. Isn't this exciting? All right, moving along to M10. We have the year 2003, $512,000 for a house, $5.12 for a loaf of bread, a dollar worth 1/10 of 1 cent, and a 128% income tax, and M10. We have arrived. How would you pay 128% income tax? And I'll give you the answer. You'd have to sell everything you own and borrow money. And you would say, well, who would do that? And I would tell you right now, American farmers all do that. Isn't that interesting? Anybody who has property does that. Because the property, the ownership of the property is a burden. Okay? All right. The ownership of anything is a burden. Okay, what happened here? Why? What happened? Let's take a look. Let's go back to 1776. We go back to 1776, and the average house was $1,000. And again, we're going to give you some books and documentation. The loaf of bread was a penny. Okay? The dollar was $1. The income tax was 0. Okay, and we still had M1. Okay? Now, 137 years go by. Okay? All these years go by. And what do we have? Why? We have no inflation, do we? Now, what do we hear when we go to school? Inflation has always been with us. Inflation is a perennial problem. Whoops, not for America. Not for the first 137 years, was it? And we've always had taxes. Well, not for the first 130 years we didn't have these taxes. By the way, you know, Will Rogers says there is a difference between death and taxes. Did you know that? He said that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Okay, but anyway, so what we have here, you see, is that Okay. Okay, as you see, that basically we have 137 years here where there wasn't any income tax or any inflation. Isn't that interesting? We didn't hear this in school, did we? We didn't hear that there was a big difference between 1776 to 1913 and 1913. We didn't hear this in economics. We didn't get this in history, did we? A few things kind of left out of the school system, isn't it, see? Well, suppose I went to school and I taught this. How long do you think I'd be on the faculty, see? See, not very long. Probably till about the college president heard I was teaching something like this, because this is not to be taught on a college campus, because this does not produce adjustment, you see. And that's what they're after with the kiddies, is adjustment. Isn't this interesting? It's not necessary that Johnny learns to read, write, or spell. It's necessary that he's adjusted. We have now just discussed higher learning. See, actually higher learning is dangerous, so you don't get any of it. You just get more years in school. It's devoid of higher learning, isn't it? All right? Because you'd be all upset if you learned something happened in 1913 that wasn't going on before, wouldn't you? And that wouldn't produce adjustment, you see. So therefore, the government must run all the schools to make sure that this adjustment is induced. All right, let's take a look at this. Okay. Well, you know, you say, well, things are different now. You know, it's not as simple, and, you know, so forth and so on. You don't want any of these simplistic answers and, you know, all this garbage that explains why people can't explain what they learned when they went to school. It's complicated, okay? All right, let's take a look at this. What happened in the country from 1776 to 1913? Was this good for the country, or was it bad for the country? So let's just analyze this for a minute, okay? What was the impact of no taxes, no income taxes, and no property taxes, well, a little bit of property taxes, but certainly no inheritance taxes on the country, where people could actually acquire property and keep it? Was this good or was it bad? Was this a positive incentive or was it a negative incentive? See, so forth and so on. So let's just take a quick look back through history, and we'll take a look and say, well, history started, I think, about the year, what was it, 3000 BC or something. Is the first time so Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, they call it. And from the Garden of Eden, which is about 3,000 years BC, something like that, okay, until America was started, 1776 AD, here, okay, what do we have? Approximately 5,000 years, something like that. And then we have a little period of time after this, okay, to 1913. Okay, little period of time. Okay, now, from this period of time to this period of time, what happened? If Adam and Eve wanted to go somewhere, they'd probably ride a horse, don't you imagine? Now, if George Washington wanted to go up to Philadelphia to the Continental Convention, and he left Mount Vernon down in Virginia, how do you suppose he would travel? He'd ride a horse, wouldn't he? So notice what we have. 5,000 years goes by, people are riding horses. That's interesting. Not a whole lot of progress, is there? Okay, let's go back. We'll look at the Bible here. We'll go back into Gideon in the Valley of Midianites. Remember, he was up there and he had all these Midianites down the valley, and they signaled to him, and they waved lanterns. This was like about 2,000 years BC. This was back in the book of Judges, okay? Now, notice, if you wanted to send a message at night 4,000 years ago, you waved a lantern, didn't you? Isn't that interesting? Now, question, here's the biggie. When Paul Revere wanted to notify us that the British were coming just 150, 200 years ago, how was he able to signal that? He put a lantern in the belfry, didn't he? Isn't that interesting? 4,000 years later, guys are waving lanterns. Hi, George. Hi, Sam. How are you? See? Good. Well, time to go. See, waving lanterns. Not a whole lot of progress, was there? Why? Because if anybody invented something, it would be taken away from him and used against him. That is called socialism. That's called from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So no, everybody makes sure he doesn't have any ability. We've now described America's welfare program. If you work, you lose. If you produce anything, out. Only if you are a non-productive, unmarried person bearing children are you eligible for these rewards. Now, what's happening to the homes in America as a result of this? Is this good for America or bad for America? What are we getting? We get what we pay for. Have you ever noticed that? If we want to pay for licentiousness, we want to pay for no production, you simply buy it. And it happens. And what is our money going for? Something that's good for the country or bad for the country? You see. Isn't that interesting? We haven't get to wars yet. We'll get to that. Wars are even more interesting because that kills the people quicker. Sometimes you can't wait for a generation. You have to do it right away. The money buys that. Okay, now notice what we have here. During this period of time, what happened in the United States? Well, let's see. We had Robert Fulton comes along. He invents a steamboat. The newspapers didn't like it. The newspapers don't like much. They're still run by the English Bank. We'll get to that later. And they called it Fulton's Folly and so forth. But he made the equivalent of today, millions of dollars, and he kept it. No tax. Well, this got to be exciting, wasn't it? Because it turns out that if you could build something that someone else benefited from and they would buy it, you would make a, quiet, profit. We don't say those words around USC, do we? Profit. Oh, very bad, greedy, filthy. You see, all these things are attached to profit. Profit is what caused the progress. Guys could keep what they earned. Isn't that exciting? Hey, the first time in history this ever happened. And no nation on earth had ever developed where the people could keep what they earned. You always had this problem of having sharecropping and so forth. That's where a lot of your wages go to the lord of the manor. You recognize it today. It's called withholding. Okay, you see? And see, we have these new names for old slavery. You see? And the result is we produce nothing. How many guys you know don't want to work extra overtime or don't want to get any more money? It's just it's a big burden because now they lose it. Why work for something that they can't keep? You see the negative impact here of this stuff. Okay? Now, all right, so we find here some interesting stuff. We have Eli Whitney comes along. He invents a cotton gin. All the cotton mills and the presses in Europe collapsed. You know what England did? They passed a law that the cotton gin was illegal in England. Boy, that would stop it, wouldn't it? The whole garment industry in England totally collapsed. Nobody produced anything anymore. It was dead or Nadornia. It was all produced from New York. Isn't that interesting? It still is. See, you can't make a law that outdoes economics. I mean, economics is the ultimate law. We're going to talk about this today. Economics is the law of why people, of motivation, why people do things. All right. Somebody once said that the pen is mightier than the sword, but the purse always buys the pen. Stay with the purse. This happened in the case of Karl Marx, where the Bank of England actually bought his pen. He's buried in England, London, of course, where his employers were. He never went to Russia. Isn't that interesting? Okay. All right. The purse buys the pen. Let's remember that. All right. The most important thing is who pays for it, because who pays for it gets what he pays for it. Well, we find that Cyrus McCormick comes along. He invents a reaper, makes what's equivalent to $1 million today, keeps it. And other guys are noticing this. Matter of fact, people are coming from Europe now because this is now called the New World, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the melting pot, if you will. People are saving up their money in Scandinavia and every place else. Their big dream is to come to America. You see, why? Because they keep what they earn. Well, a little while later, Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, keeps all the money. Matter of fact, he bought all much of the land up around Monterey, up the coast in there, all the canneries and so forth, and his posterity still owns that. He passed it on down to his grandchildren, his children's children, and so forth, and they still own that. They still have it in the family, you see, because he invented a telegraph. Isn't that interesting? A few other things, too. Well, we find that a guy came along by the name of Alexander Bell, and he invents a telephone. Isn't this interesting? He keeps the money. Well, another fellow comes along by the name of Marconi. Now, Marconi actually invented the radio in Italy. He didn't dare introduce it there because the government would take it away from it, the government radio. So he went to England, and he tried to introduce it in England, and they put him in a mental institution. They put him in, and meanwhile, the boys in the bank got his invention, and 20 years before he was able to get to America and release the invention, they were talking back and forth between London and New York. Isn't that interesting? With his radio. But nevertheless, he was able to get out of the funny farm and come over to America, where he introduced it and made millions of dollars as a result of inventing the radio. He didn't dare introduce this invention in any other country. It would be taken away from him. It would be stolen. That's why in the first 5,000 years, nobody invented a radio. It's really not hard to figure that out, is it? If you've been in the Army, you understand how that works. Anybody who produces anything in the Army is taken in and given what they call a GI shower. The other guys don't like it when you do things that make them look bad. You stand in the middle of the third row, you never volunteer for anything, you wear the same suit, and you don't look any different and you don't do any differently. You got that? because the next shower is with lie. You see, and you can take care of guys that produce things, because the peer pressure not to produce is extremely high, you see, if that information is used against the other people. In other words, if you peel potatoes twice as fast as the norm, the next guy has to peel potatoes faster. That is a threat to him. And they'll take care of you. There's ways to do that. Sometimes it's called missing in action. But you will not peel twice as fast. Got it? Under no condition will that ever happen. You see? Any progress is penalized. And as a result, nobody produces anything. It's pretty simple to figure out, isn't it? All right. A fellow comes along by the name of Thomas Edison. He invents some electric lights and recorded sound and so forth and so on. Makes millions of dollars. He keeps it all. Can you imagine this? These guys kept it. Wasn't that greedy? It's hard to believe. All these inventions are made by these greedy people, isn't it? All right. And then now you got the Wright brothers come along. They invent some airplanes. They fly around, keep the money. This is interesting. Henry Ford comes along, introduces the mass production of automobiles. People are driving. There aren't even any roads. Henry's driving all over in cow trails. Model T's this high off the ground so they can go through the mud. Only in America. Notice these things didn't come from any other place. Oh, there was a spin-off, and France could copy us. After we had the airplane, then they could copy the airplane. And after we had the mass production automobile, then they could copy that. You see, notice the most advanced technological country today. Now, I come from up in Silicon Valley, up there, San Jose area. And it's really interesting because we hear about the Japanese and the Germans and all the Koreans and all these guys that are passing us in the production of stuff. But you see, they're not passing us in the development of things. The only thing that they can produce is a copy of what we invented last Friday. You notice that? It's really fascinating. But because there's still enough private enterprise available here that it rewards innovation, and it doesn't exist in the other countries. The only thing that exists there is the copycat thing, where they can actually maybe take apart something that's already been made, and then they can figure it out maybe how to do it a little better. But they can't come up with something new to make. Oh boy. You see, this only happened in America. Because only in America could you keep it if you made it. Over there, it would be taken away from them. Now, the thing changes. If a Japanese person comes over here, it all changes. Now he can invent things too. You see, it's not his race, it's his economy. See, because you can't say Italians are stupid because Marconi invented the radio. It's just, in Italy, they don't do anything. Okay? And neither would you if you lived in Italy. And neither would I, because it's just taken away. It's better off to just go down to the beach and go swimming and forget it. Which they've been doing for 5,000 years. All right, we went literally from horse and buggies to the age of flight in about, just a little over 100 years after the Constitution was written. Isn't that interesting? Now, what marked that period of time? What was the distinguishing characteristic? The distinguishing characteristic was no income tax and no inflation. Are we having fun? That's what produced the greatest progress the world has ever seen. So our thesis today is the greatest, the most patriotic, the most red-blooded, all-American thing you could possibly do is make all the money you can make and pay no tax. It's America one. Now what we're going to show you is that there were two countries. Okay? We have here America one, and we have here America two. Let me explain the primary difference between the two of them. This was what we call a constitutional republic. All laws were based upon the Constitution of the United States. In 1913, the Constitution was flawed to such an extreme event that it made it a completely different country. You could no longer keep all the money you made, and you could no longer pass property on to your children and so forth. Okay? It was an entirely different country, and it became what we call a legislative democracy. The legislative democracy today runs side by side with the constitutional republic. And you can choose, they're both, incidentally, just out of pure coincidence, called America. They're both called the United States, you see, because the idea is to fool us, but they are different countries. And they exist side by side today, okay? Now, you can still live in America one, but you have to know how, and that's what the rest of our seminar is about. Is this fun or what? Okay? This is like or return to our roots. Okay, now, you see, because this is going to strip everything away. The primary book up here was the Constitution of the United States, actually based with the Declaration of Independence, where we are created, and of course endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights. Notice it wasn't inalienable rights. The inalienable has a different, these were unalienable. Nobody could put a lien on it. The government, it says governments were instituted among men to secure these rights. Now, notice what's happening down here. The government is putting the liens on. Up here, their job is to keep the liens off, so nobody can lien your property. You can still live here. There's ways to do it. Okay? I mean, this is great stuff. The people that you read about, well, actually, the people you don't read about, the super rich, we get this garbage in the newspaper, but every year, the richest guy in the world is some guy that owns a drugstore or some guy that owns a department store. I mean, come on. Where's the guys with the banks and the oils? Okay, they're up here. How come they aren't listed as the richest men in the world? Well, because we're going to show you they have been able to own this property or control this property without owning it. See, Rockefeller really doesn't own Standard Oil, he just controls it. The Rothschild Bank of England really doesn't own our Federal Reserve System, it just controls it. Hey, is that great or what? See, if you control it, there's no tax on control, there's only a tax on ownership. Got it? But the guys with the drugstores and so forth, well, they are really making a lot of money, according to the Wall Street Journal. But all the guys with the really heavy bucks are always missing from these charts. Okay, amazing what we learn when we get out of school. Let's go back into some history now and figure out what happened, what caused all this. Because if we don't understand the past, we don't understand the present. Isn't this interesting? All right? So I want to go back to, our Garden of Eden scene again. Of course, then we had a flood, and the flood went away, and people started a thing called the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was where some guy made a record and called it, "I'll Do It My Way." And so they had to speak different languages, go different parts of the country, okay? Yeah, different parts of the world, okay? Now, around the Mediterranean, what we call the Western world, sprang up some world governments of sorts. The first major world government that we hear about is Egypt. And this is all, of course, in the Old Testament of the Bible. There were your pharaohs. Egypt was a very interesting country because the guy at the top considered himself to be God. This may surprise you. See, people in government always like that title. It comes with the job, it seems. Yes, they really enjoyed that. All right? So, you see, and so to do anything against this guy was considered blasphemy. Well, you can't beat that. Any kind of revolution was a rebellion against God, you see. And they worshipped the sun, and they had temples that they met in, and they had temple priestesses and temple prostitutes and temple this and temple that, and they had all this, these strange things that they worship, like the, different phenomenon, okay, like frogs and so forth that they worshipped in Egypt. Well, Egypt was eventually conquered by a country called Assyria. Assyria was, sort of up where Iran, Iraq are today, in that area. And they conquered Egypt. Now, the guy who ran Assyria, this may come as a shock, considered himself to be God. See, notice the name and the location changes, but the title remains the same. Okay? And they had a temple thing, and they had sun worship, and you see, it's kind of like the same thing. Well, this goes on for a few years, and then there were some guys from Babylon, which is down further south from Assyria, Babylon, and they conquered Assyria. Isn't that interesting? Now, in Babylon, the king up there, for some reason, thought he was God. You see, same deal. They had temples, and they had these rituals. They worshiped the sun, and da-da-da-da. Okay, ready? Okay, another world empire comes along, conquers this Babylon. This is the Medo-Persian. The Median tribes up in the north were basically up around the Baltic Sea up in there. And then you had the Persians, Medo-Persian, okay, which is where Iran is today. Okay? Now, the thing that characterized this guy was that he thought he was God. See how this changes from time to time? Okay? So we have God, 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 God. Got it? See, history isn't that hard to remember, okay? Now, okay, and things went along pretty well until he was conquered by Greece. Alexander the Great conquered this. Alexander the Great was an interesting guy. One item of note about him was that he thought he was God. Okay? And they had he worshipped the sun and a few things, and they had little temple prostitutes, temple priests, and so forth, and pretty much the same thing. And then he was conquered by Rome. Isn't that interesting? And the Roman Caesars had this little trait that they like to have people call him, you know. It went something like God. See? So the guy who runs government always thinks he's God. This is not something that the IRS just created recently. This has been going on for some time. See, if we don't understand history, we don't understand the National Enquirer, okay? As we go through Safeway, our trip is meaningless. Okay, now, so what happens, okay? So we find here that in order to be able to understand this, we have to have a grasp on what's been going on before we got here, okay? Now we're ready to understand ourselves. All right? Now, let's erase this again. This is going to be fun. Ta-da! This is getting easier. Oh, that lubricated. I guess there was no lubrication under or something. Okay. There we go. All right, now, so if we took this another way, we say from 3,000 years BC, okay, for the first 3,000 years until the time of Christ, we have a government that was primarily involved with external control, don't we? External control. Even the old Hebrew religion, if you want to know what to do, well, some guy went up to the mountain and he got some tablets, and he brought these tablets back and said, guys, here's what we're going to do. Notice it was not a democratic meeting, because they would have come up with the golden calf if they did it, wouldn't they? Okay, but he came up with these tablets, you see, and said, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and all these things. Well, hey, that's not what we want to do, is it? See, that was external. That was external stuff, see? And he says, if you do this stuff, you're going to die. Okay. So, guys have been trying it ever since. Okay, now, so what happens, okay? And so what causes a lot of death, okay? Okay, you see, this doesn't come from what the guy wants to do. It comes from an external source. The guy at the top had this little attribute. He was always right, because he was God. Now, you can't beat that for authority. That's as good as it gets. Okay, now, okay, along comes our friend Christ now. Interesting guy. And his name was Emmanuel. Does anybody know what Emmanuel meant in Hebrew? God with us. God is with us. See, God isn't afar. God isn't out there. God is with us. See? And he comes along now. He preaches the gospel of the kingdom. This is really interesting. And where did he say this kingdom was? Anybody have any idea? Well, he said his kingdom was within us, didn't he? And right, it wasn't of this earth. It was within us. See? And so John explains that. He comes along and he says, well, greater is he who's within you than he who's in the world. Can anybody see a conflict arising here? You know what they did with this guy? Ooh, not good. Kimosabe, not good. You notice what he did? He introduced the concept of internal control, didn't he? Oh boy, problems. Problems. Isn't that interesting? Now, what we're going to show you for the next half an hour, and how much time do we have till the break here, Guy? Well, what time did we start?
Started at 9.
Okay, so we've been going... Okay, so let's go for about an hour and take a break, and then we'll come back for another hour and take another break, and then we'll come back, and then there will be no break after that. No, I'm kidding. Now, okay, so... All right, nobody will come back after that. Now, see, because I submit to you that if we understand this, we'll understand, like, what's going on with our paychecks. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll have a break, I want to talk about what was the effect of internal control on the world. Because there was some effect. If you look at a map, and I'm not a good cartologist here, but anyway, what you have is the Mediterranean Ocean, something like this, and you got Africa, and you have Arabia Peninsula, and you got India over here, and you've got Europe and Scandinavia coming over here like this, and you've got England over here, all right? Now, there you've got what's called the Caucasus Mountains. Now, out of this melting pot, if you will, or the beginning of civilization, we find there were two flows. One flow went this way, and one flow went this way, both of them ending up in England. England is our pivot point here in history. It's interesting, okay? Now, what you're going to find is that these people had internal motivation. Okay, these people became what we know as your Caucasians. They became known as the Anglo-Saxons. There's all kinds of names for them. They went into Germany where they became the Teutons. They went into Scandinavia where they became the Vandals and eventually the Vikings. They had one characteristic that was impeccable. They were never conquered by anybody. Nobody messed with them. They were not very civilized, but nobody had any trouble with them, okay? Because they just didn't kill you, just look at you. Yeah, yeah, that's you. That's roots. Okay, you see, but the internal thing was like on. And they would have raids on England, they'd have raids on all these places. They come out of the forge, you know, they had this god called Odin. You know, well, it's interesting, we won't get into all that, but he ran the bank and a few things. Okay, now, along here, we have basically our Latin type people, okay, which is Greece, Italy, France, Spain, and so forth. Now, the characteristic of this group of people was external control. Matter of fact, they went into France, and today we find Ireland is populated by your people from France, whereas Scotland is populated by people from Scandinavia, basically, okay? So you find a big difference in the people. You'll find a big difference in their governments. You'll find a big difference in how they relate to things as a culture. Now, if a person leaves and goes to another culture, then he will change. It's not a racial characteristic, it is a cultural characteristic. But this seems to be inherent in the culture for some reason, all right? Along here was the Roman Catholic Church, for example. They would burn you if you read the Bible. You didn't read the Bible. And matter of fact, well, we're going to find here some interesting things. The Tyndale actually read the Bible in English in 1377. He was burned at the stake because he stole the church property. Yeah. I mean, see, what did that do to the church? Well, if you could read the Bible, you wouldn't need their external control, would you? See the difference, okay? So we're going to see that all the way down, this is conflicted with government, whether it's church government or civil government. There's been this tremendous conflict now between internal and external control. America I was internal control. America II from 1913 is external control imposed on us. Did anybody voluntarily pay his income tax last year? No, it was stolen from you, wasn't it? It was stolen. You couldn't even get it back. See, it was external. You didn't decide that. Somebody else decided it. But see, that wasn't existing in America I. When we understand this, we'll come out of here with a great power that we didn't have when we walked in here. You quit work, yeah. Well, the secret is you quit working for someone else. Now you want to work for yourself because you get to keep it if you work for yourself. See the difference? Okay. So what happens over here is that this culminates in what we call the feudal system. Over in England, we had a king. Now, king means sovereign in Latin, the terms of Caesar. Okay, it means the guy who owns the place, the guy who owns the land. The guy who owns the land usually has all the power and all the wealth. It's not very simple. The power is in the land, as far as economics are concerned. Okay, in German, that's called Kaiser. In Russian, it's called Tsar. In English, it's called king. It's the same word. It comes from the Latin word sovereign, or Caesar. Okay, the king had his nobles, the knights, the dukes, the duchess, the earls, the barons, and so forth, and that was about 5% of his population. And then the people who actually did the work were the serfs, the 95%, okay? Now, how this shook down was that your people from this area down here came and became your serfs, and the people from this area came down and became the nobles. And so you had this noble class here of people. Now, I wouldn't say class, this noble category of people. It wasn't a class, it was sort of like they were just the guys. The king had a proper system of rents. He would rent the land to the nobles, who in turn would subrent it to the serfs. Everybody had to do their fair share and all this kind of stuff, whatever. That meant as little as you could get by with. Because nobody could keep what he earned. Even the nobles were being changed. And as a matter of fact, this guy John was really a nut, this King John. And his favorite entertainment after a meal was to have the curtains part and watch nobles being hanged. They'd hang nobles after dinner as for sort of a treat. And guys would go, "Blah." And so the nobles got together and they said, you know, this is not good for our health. And so what they did was that they got a big army together. The barons got a big army together, and they asked John to come down for a little seminar they were having south of the Thames River there in Runnymede. And so they surrounded John with their army, and they said, John, we would like you to sign in the year 1215. We would like you to sign a document called the Magna Carta. And the king says, well, what does that mean? They said, well, it means magnificent contract. He says, yes, I know, but what does it do? And they said, oh, it gives us the ownership of England. You see, after today, you won't own England anymore. We'll own England. I mean, was this a deal or what? Never in the history of time had anybody ever come up with that idea. It came right out of these guys. It was the Viking stuff, see? So John says, well, you know, he goes out for a little break. He looks at his army. He says, why would I say anything like that? And they said, well, if you'll sign it, then we won't cut your head off this afternoon as scheduled. So we do a lot of seminars across the country. We do a lot of motivational training with our agents and so forth. And basically we found that you can't beat that for a good close. And so the king bought a Magna Carta. He signed on the line which was dotted, and now the Magna Carta is in effect. The king was no longer the sovereign in England. Isn't that interesting? The king didn't own the place. The nobles owned the place. Did this have an effect on England? You bet. You bet. Because it wasn't very long later, until about 1295 here, some interesting things happened, because this was our Magna Carta. Okay? They said, well, look, this is really kind of crazy. We own the land, and the king is still taxing us. The king was putting the tax on the land, is still collecting the tax. And so the guys got together, and they said, well, this doesn't make any sense. So they went to the king in 1215, and they said, King, we want to start a parliament. And he said, well, what's that? And they said, well, that's where we make the law instead of you. The king looks out the window, he sees their army, and he says something like, okie dokie. Reminds me of the story about Jimmy Carter. Supposedly David Rockefeller called up Jimmy Carter back in the late 60s and said, Jimmy, if we make you president of the United States, would you do everything I tell you? And Jimmy thought, and he said, peanut butter. Okay, so anyway, so what we have, you see, is basically the same thing, okay? So the king now no longer made the king. It's really hard to do serious seminars. Okay, now, so what happens? So the king no longer made the law. The law was made by the nobles. And what do you suppose they decided? Well, they wouldn't pay tax. What a shock. Just like that. I mean, just pass the law. The nobles from now on would not be taxed. Are we having fun? So now what did they do? Well, they went all to the world. They went into Africa, they went to India, they went to China, they went to Australia, they went to the New World, North America. In every place they went, the nobles could make everything they wanted to make, and they were never taxed. Now, occasionally, the indigenous citizens wanted to tax them, like Mahatma Gandhi or something like this, and they would decide, okay, since these guys from England are getting all the natural resources out of our country, we want to tax them. Now, the noble had a solution to that. Okay? What he would do then is that he would bring in the British Army. And the government now would no longer be an indigenous government. It would be called a colony. See, a colony is where the laws are made from London. Is this interesting? Where now the nobles make the law, and they decided that they wouldn't even be taxed in any part of the world. And if they had a problem with that, the British Army would go in. Now, what happened, you see, was that the British Army was protecting the business of the nobles. The British Army went all over the world. It came to the point where the sun never set on the British Empire. The British Empire was simply the nobles making all the money they wanted to make and keeping it. We now understand British Empire. That's all it was. And to make sure that there weren't any problems, they had an army. And it was a good army. This army, before 1700, went 300 years undefeated. All the powers of the world put together could not defeat the British Army. It was incredible. It was powerful. Nobody fussed with the British Army. Well, that was Parliament, 1295. Okay, then as we pointed out, some interesting things happen here. See, notice what we're learning. A little bit of internal control. A little more internal control. You see why history cannot be taught in the government school? Because it's going contrary to the government philosophy. And so it's just not taught. It's called, it's not there, existentialism. Okay, now, okay? Okay, so then along about 1379, we have Tyndale. Tyndale printed the Bible in English. He was burned, okay, Tyndale. Okay, along about 1420, we have, or I'm sorry, that was Wycliffe, excuse me, that was Wycliffe. I get these guys all mixed up here. That was John Wycliffe. He was burned at the stake. Okay, John Tyndale had the same thing happen to him. Okay, that was 100 years later. Okay, or many years later. Okay, we have Tyndale, and then Wycliffe up here. All right, and Henry VIII cut his head off because Henry VIII was a Roman Catholic at the time. That was against their law. Well, Henry VIII now had some interesting problems because he didn't have a son. After he'd been married to this Catherine of Aragon for 8 years, he'd had a couple girls, but no male children. And so he went to his Archbishop, Sir Thomas More, and he said, Tom, he said, I'm paraphrasing this, I want a divorce. And Tom says, good grief, Henry, you can't have a divorce. You've been married 8 years. He said, that's okay, I want an annulment. And he said, you got to annul 8-year marriage. And so he checks with the Pope and says, can't be done. So Henry has a very novel and imaginative, creative solution to this problem. He cuts off Tom's head. Okay? And then he starts a church called the Catholic Church of England. And he is the Pope. Is this interesting? And of course, then he went ahead and introduced the concept of disposable wives right now. And so what happens, you see, is that now there was a new church. The Holy Roman Empire had just collapsed. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman or it was an empire. All it was that the Pope blessed the kings. So it made the king have the benefit from the so-called God-man or whatever have you. Okay. Now, so you see, the system really is they're still trying to push it. Okay, it's interesting. Okay, that the guy on top is God. Okay, interesting stuff. All right. Now, to shield it within the framework of our country, now you don't know who the guy is. Like, who is the guy that owns the Federal Reserve System? Well, let's see. We know the Federal Reserve System is not an American corporation. We know it's not a government agency. We know that the president can appoint governors, but governors don't own the place. Who owns it? Well, obviously it must be God. Isn't that interesting, you see? Okay, the internal control is wrecking the external control. There's a conflict going on. Don't kid yourself. And you can choose which side you want to be on. One is like a wave coming in. One's a wave going out. You know, this is like the reason Russia collapsed is because it was going the wrong way. If you go the wrong way, you collapse. If you buy into America too, you're going this way. You will collapse. You won't own anything on Friday. You'll work 40 years and be broke. You'll die spending your kids' inheritance. The kids don't have any inheritance. You got to live off them. Because the thing is going this way. Now, it doesn't have to go this way. This is what our meeting is all about. Okay, interesting stuff. So we have 1420 comes along, Tyndale. All right? Henry VIII now, in 1440, excuse me. In 1442, Henry VIII now has written in the British Constitution that the King of England is the head of the church. That's still in the British Constitution, by the way. Did you know that a few years back, and it says in the British Constitution, by the way, that if a commoner marries a member of royalty, it requires the permission of the church. I mean, the church, the government over in England still runs the Anglican Church. Now, did you know that a few years back, when Prince Charles wanted to marry Princess Diana, or whatever her name was, that required the permission of the church? You see? And his mom said, okay. All right? Now, again, not knowing history makes the National Enquirer undecipherable. Okay, now, you see, once we get history, we have an interesting shot at it, don't we? We have an interesting shot at it. Okay, now we have Henry VIII come along. Well, Henry VIII began what was called the Anglican Church, and he took Tyndale's Bible. You know, it was really interesting that Tyndale's prayer just before his head was cut off was that God may open the eyes of the Church of England, or the King of England. And in about 1445, Henry VIII decided that Tyndale's Bible was pretty good after all. He had manuscripts printed or written and put in all the churches in England. Isn't that interesting? So he changed his mind. So for Tyndale, it was a little bit late. Okay? But the interesting thing is, see, even though the guy dies physically, his works live on. This is kind of an interesting concept. Because even though these guys were martyred, they were very effective. They were really instituting internal control, even though their body was taken away. This is heavy stuff. Okay, now this goes along now until about 1599. And again, I'm just jumping through this. You can get back into history and you can find all kinds of stuff. I mean, I'm just skipping through the rocks here. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, 1599, we had Gutenberg. Okay, what happened to Gutenberg? Well, he invented the movable type press. Up until this time, there weren't any libraries because nobody had any books. The only books were in monasteries or somewhere where they were laboriously hand copied. Now all of a sudden Gutenberg invents a printing press, movable type. Okay, What happens in 1601? The king of Scotland, James, comes down. The Stuart kings, because Mary, Queen of Scots, was back in Henry VIII's daughter, running England and converting, putting all the Protestant or so-called Anglican people in. This is why John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, wrote it in prison, because all the preachers were put in prison, and the Roman government was brought back, the Roman Church was brought back, and so James comes down from Scotland, and he completely takes over England, and he introduces actually what was called the Scottish Presbyterian Church at that time. He didn't even introduce the Church of England. Okay, but he had all the Bibles printed in English. Isn't this interesting? So this King James Bible now was produced about 1611. So here we have the King James Version of the Bible. And it was written in English, and it was printed on a press, and everybody was given a copy. So the government sanctioned everybody in England now having a copy of this Bible. Well, you'd think that'd be the end of the problems for England. That was the start of their problems. Because guys would start reading this Bible now, and this was amazing because they never had a book before, so they wanted to learn to read, they read from the Bible. They wanted to teach somebody to read, they read from the Bible. They wanted to have a book at home, they had the Bible. It was the only book there was. Well, it had a tremendous effect on England. It's the basis of the whole English language. Okay, it also changed England radically because it said in the Bible that Jesus Christ was the head of the church. Uh-oh. Does anyone see a conflict? Mm-hmm. And so they decided, well, we want to start teaching our children that Jesus Christ is sovereign. They said, no, the government will teach the kids because we want to teach them that the king is sovereign. We've now understood public education, haven't we? Who's the sovereign? You're going to get different stories depending on the source of the education, aren't you? And for the government to be sovereign, it must run the schools. That's the 10th platform of the Communist Manifesto, by the way. That can't happen until governments run the schools. Oh, boy. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, now, so it doesn't take these guys very long. It takes like 9 years. And these guys just blow. I mean, they blow. They said, this isn't right. They said, let us get thee out of here. They get some boats, and they sail. They sail over. They sail over to America. Nobody even went there before. I mean, that was it. You see, they wanted to worship the sovereign, the spiritual sovereign. Well, okay, so now we have the Mayflower. Isn't that interesting? Now, we often hear that these were called the colonies. Notice that's just recent history. They did not call themselves colonies or colonists. Isn't that interesting? They said that they would start, in the charter of the Mayflower Compact, they said, well, we really owe a debt of gratitude to King James, and we really think that was great, and now we're going to start a body politic. What's a body politic? It's a separate nation, isn't it? They just started a separate nation. Because out of this Bible, the Puritans got the concept that the self was governed by itself, not by somebody else. And that the self gave way to the family, and the family was run from within, that the family was best run inside than outside, which gave way to the church, and the church was better run inside than from outside, and which gave way also to business. And their business should be run by them and not by the state, and they had their civil government should be run by them and not by somebody else. Totally internal. It was like, thanks, King James, but we'd rather do it ourselves. Well, Europe laughed these guys to scorn. Nobody had ever had a government run from inside. You know, always they had to have a king and all this kind of stuff. I mean, nobody, how could you have everybody run a government? Everybody own all the land? Oh, this wasn't going to last very long. They sat back, and these guys thought they could own the land, you see. Interesting, isn't it? What's so fascinating is it's still going. Okay? Now, all right? So you say, well, why didn't this idea catch on? Why didn't this just spread like wildfire and we all be born in the 30s, 40s, 50s, whenever we're born, into countries that are all over the world have these constitutions and have these self-governments? What happened? Well, we're going to find out that there's a crowd of people, as they say, we're going to find out that in the game there's another team on the field. And there's a team on the field that doesn't like internal control because that way they don't have control over you. Now, in order to win this game, we have to know what this other team is. And we're going to come back from our break, and it's called central banking. The boys live in the central bank, and the central bank gets to control the country. And I won't tell you how, because it's a big secret, and I don't want to spoil your next hour. Okay, but there's a word that explains it. Anybody know what that word is? Okay, we'll get into it next hour. We're going to explain it. Well, I'll give you a clue. The word is debt. The control